How did Lord Horatio Nelson use Mission Command to close the OODA loop on his enemies? We look at 4 battles to find examples of the Nelson touch.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 51 of the Principles of War podcast. Today, we're looking at Lord Horatio Nelson and how he practiced Mission Command. Now, this may come as quite a surprise podcast to you, but I think this is one of our enduring essential tasks to better understand Mission Command. So today, we're going to be using Lord Horatio Nelson, and I'm going to pick 4 of the battles that he fought in to look for a better understanding of what Mission Command is, why Mission Command is important, and we're going to look for some specific examples from Nelson about how he practiced Mission Command that we can use to better practice Mission Command in our jobs and, more importantly, to empower our teams to use Mission Command as well. Our story starts on the 29th of September 1758 in Norfolk, where Horatio Nelson was born. He was the 6th of 11 children, and it runs all the way through to the 21st of October, 1805. That is the Battle of Trafalgar. That is when Lord Horatio Nelson was killed, and that is where his story ends and the legend begins. Now, interesting fact. After the Battle of Trafalgar, it is only 51 weeks until the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. As some of you may know, those battles were critical in the formation, the development of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, which became a critical part in the Prussian and German way of fighting. It was where the Prussian army learned that the brilliance and capability of the Prussians under Frederick the Great was no longer enough to allow them to win on the battlefield. The tactics and lessons learned by Frederick the Great and exercised by his army had been studied meticulously by Napoleon. He had improved on them. Not only that, he had looked at the technological innovations that were occurring through industry and understood where he could improve on the art of war. Jena and Auerstedt destroyed the reputation of the Prussian army. And nothing says mission fail like enemy troops entering your capital city, which is exactly what Napoleon did as he marched his troops through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. That occurred on the 27th of October, 1806. That disaster set in train a blank canvas for the Prussian generals to look at the way that they were conducting warfare and look at ways that they could improve it, because they had to improve it. They were no longer able to defend the state. So the interesting academic question is, was Helmut von Moltke aware of any of the practices or thinkings of Lord Nelson as he went about restructuring the way that the Prussian army would think and conduct military operations? It is, though, only an academic question, because whether or not he was aware of the way that Nelson operated, there are certainly rhymes between Auftragstaktik and the Nelson touch, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, one of the other reasons that I was really keen to look at Nelson and Trafalgar is that last year when we read through the rules of the game by Andrew Gordon, he mentioned the long, calm lee of Trafalgar and that the canker of a long peace is a bad preparation for war. Now, of course, he was talking about the Battle of Jutland, which had occurred almost 100 years after Trafalgar, and the way that the thinking within the Royal Navy had declined since the apogee of Trafalgar. What I wanted to do was to look at Trafalgar and just see what that high point looked like and what it was that was missing at Jutland. And so this is a really good starting point as we start to switch targets onto Jutland at some stage. So we'll have a quick look at Lord Horatio Nelson. As I said, born in 1758 in Norfolk, his mother died when he was only 9. Now, she was the great niece of Robert Walpole, who was the de facto first Prime Minister of Britain. He first went to sea at the age of 12 on his uncle's ship. His uncle was Captain Maurice Suckling on the third-rate HMS Raisonnable, and he went to sea as an ordinary seaman. So his family connections would indicate that he came from a relatively well-off family. It was on the Raisonnable that he discovered that he suffered from seasickness, which is quite interesting considering that he is probably the Royal Navy's greatest admiral. But he didn't let this constitutional flaw get in the way of his career, and this wasn't the only constitutional flaw that he had, and he was to suffer from a series of diseases, including malaria and dysentery, and on a couple of occasions, sickness took him almost to death's door. Not only that, it wasn't just illness, it was also wounds as well, and he would get a significant number of wounds throughout his career. His career continued on with various adventures, serving on a merchant vessel sailing to Jamaica, attempting to find a northeast passage to the Arctic, back to the East Indies where he contracted malaria. Meanwhile, his uncle, Maurice Suckling, had risen to become the Comptroller of the Navy. Nelson was appointed as acting lieutenant aboard HMS Worcester, and they sailed for Gibraltar. Due to his capabilities and performance, he was recommended to Sir Peter Parker, who was the Commander-in-Chief at Jamaica. Sir Peter took him on board his ship, the HMS Bristol. This was during the American War of Independence, and the entry of the French on the side of the Americans meant that there was a lot of prize money available for naval officers. Prize money was money awarded to the officers and crew of a ship when they captured an enemy ship or merchantman carrying enemy cargo. And during this period, Nelson was awarded £400, which works out to be about $67,000 in today's money. Sir Peter appointed Nelson Master and Commander of the brig HMS Badger in late 1778, and he sailed the Badger around the Central American coast, including British Honduras and Nicaragua. On the 11th of June 1779, he found out that he had been promoted to post captain and that he was to be given command of the 28-gun HMS Hinchinbrook. Now, Nelson handed over to Cuthbert Collingwood. Now, Cuthbert Collingwood wasn't going to be one of the band of brothers who would fight during the Battle of the Nile with Nelson, but he was one of the captains who fought with Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent and the Battle of Trafalgar. This is one of those interesting areas where we start to see the development of the relationships with his peers and what would be his subordinates as he progressed up the ranks. As his commands grew in importance, there was an increasing number of officers who had served with him and who knew what he was like, the way that he liked to fight, and they knew the part that they needed to play in the battle. The Hinchinbrook sailed from Jamaica in February 1780, in support of Major General John Dowling's attempt to capture a number of Spanish colonies in Central America. He sailed up the San Juan River and, with 1,000 men and 4 cannon, sieged the Fortress of the Immaculate Conception, or Castillo of Baello. He spent a significant amount of time in the jungle and narrowly avoided being bitten on the head by a snake hanging from a tree. One of the members of their party was bitten by a snake just under the eye, and he was dead within 4 hours. Another member of the party was mauled by a tiger-like animal in the jungle. Sir Peter Parker recalled Nelson, probably not too soon because he was getting increasingly ill, probably with malaria. He was given command of the 4-gun frigate HMS Janus, but he was so sick that he was actually returned back to England and was lucky to be alive by the time he got back. He was next given command of HMS Albemarle and was given a job of escorting a convoy from Denmark, and for that the Admiralty placed with him under command 2 frigates, HMS Argo and HMS Enterprise. This is the first time he'd had other ships under his command. He then sailed to Quebec and back to Jamaica before the War of Independence ended. In 1784, Nelson was given command of HMS Boreas and the mission to enforce the Navigation Act in the West Indies. Part of this was ensuring that only those permitted to trade with the West Indies were allowed to do so. And that meant that the United States was no longer allowed to trade in the West Indies. After the War of Independence, they were no longer British citizens. They had given up the right to trade with the West Indies. He was to be serving under Admiral Sir Richard Hughes, and on sailing from Portsmouth, he carried Sir Richard's wife and daughter. His period of service under Sir Richard didn't get off to a great start because on the trip out, Lady Hughes ended up costing Nelson over £200. In return for that, she presented him with a tea caddy, which was worth less than 5 shillings. However, Nelson was very happy because he was the senior captain and second in command to the station. On meeting Sir Richard, it didn't take Nelson long to form an opinion of him. Sir Richard lived in a boarding house at Barbados rather than living on a ship, which would have been more the style of a British admiral. Nelson's reported as writing that Hughes and all around him were ninnies, and most of his captains were geese. And evidently Sir Richard spent a lot of the time playing the fiddle, so Nelson remarked, "Therefore, as his time is taken up tuning that instrument, you will consequently expect the squadron is cursedly out of tune." He disliked Lady Hughes's eternal clack and overall detested the country. His biggest problem, though, was that he thought the Admiral had allowed himself to be duped by the islanders into allowing the Yankees to trade with the islands, which the navigation laws had forbidden. After the American colonies had become independent, they had become foreigners. Here we see some of the complications in Nelson's life and his character, because the way that he went about discussing this matter with his commanding officer was relatively tactless. He demanded to know whether it was not his duty to ensure that the island's trade was with the British and not with the Americans. Hughes said he had no orders. Nelson then went on to say that this was very odd since every captain was furnished with the Navigation Act, and he produced it and read it aloud. Sir Richard took legal advice, and a month later he sent an order to Nelson stating that he had taken good advice and required captains not to hinder Americans from coming in to the islands if the governors chose to allow them. One governor who was admitting the Americans was General Shirley of the Leeward Islands. And as Nelson wrote, "Mr. Shirley, I soon trimmed and silenced." Shirley was insulted and retorted that old generals were not in the habit of taking advice from young gentlemen, to which Nelson replied, "I have the honour, sir, of being as old as the Prime Minister of England, and think myself as capable of commanding one of His Majesty's ships as that minister is of governing the state." Nelson insisted that it was not a preference but a duty as a Royal Navy captain and the senior officer afloat in the theatre to strictly enforce the laws. Nelson wrote Admiral Hughes a letter. "I beg to leave to hope that I may be properly understood. Whilst I have the honour to command an English man of war, I shall never allow myself to be subservient to the will of any governor, nor to cooperate with him in doing illegal acts. They shall make proper application to me for whatever they want to come by water." Now, Admiral Hughes's legal opinion probably came from the Attorney General of Barbados. Nelson finished his letter with, "How the King's Attorney General conceives he has a right to give an illegal opinion, which I assert the above is, he must answer for. I know the navigation laws." British historian Michael Lewis wrote that Nelson, at this point of his career, he said, "Here then is a young naval officer, very keen, very ambitious, very proud of his service, burning with patriotism, in a position of real authority for the first time, very sure that he was 100% right." Nelson wrote, "I must either disobey my orders or disobey acts of Parliament. I determined upon the former, trusting on the uprightness of my intention, and believed that my country would not allow me to be ruined by protecting her commerce." Now, Terry Coleman, in The Nelson Touch, the life and legend of Horatio Nelson, he says that any admiral of temper would have sent Nelson home. An admiral of subtlety would have had him survey every beach, inlet and freshwater spring on the farthest and most obscure islands of the station. Only 3 captains on the station tried to hinder American trade, and that was Nelson himself, Collingwood, and Collingwood's younger brother, Wilfred. and it was only Nelson who seized vessels. The others were fearful of getting into scrapes. Nelson wasn't quite so fearful. He seized 6 vessels. The situation worsened. Hughes was doing nothing about the American trade, and Nelson was fuming about it. So in March 1785, he wrote not only to the Secretary of the Admiralty. This is something that very few captains would have the temerity to do. Nelson went one further and wrote to the First Lord, and then he went one further again and wrote to His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State, Lord Stanley, who was the Home Secretary, and was also responsible for the West Indian colonies. Little historical diversion, this is the Lord Sydney that Sydney in New South Wales is named after. The situation became increasingly dire. Ship owners had tried to sue Nelson for £40,000 sterling, which is over $5 million in today's money. So that would have truly bankrupted Nelson if they'd been successful. As a part of that, he was required to stay on his ship for over 8 weeks. The lawsuit ended up following him back to England after he'd left Jamaica. In the end, Nelson won, but it was somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory. The Treasury thanked Sir Richard Hughes for his activity and zeal in protecting British commerce. One of the important lessons of this for Nelson in his dispute around the Navigation Acts was that it reinforced his desire to define his duty on his own terms. He became more likely to trust in his own judgment for on-the-scene circumstances, and this would emerge repeatedly in his future. Tragically, often getting into what he referred to as scrapes with the Admiralty and with the British government. Nelson returned to Portsmouth in the Boreas in July 1787, but it wasn't exactly a happy homecoming. He was unpopular with the crew because he had sentenced 3 members to 24 strokes of the cat for using mutinous language. According to the law, only 24 lashes could be awarded after a court-martial. However, this rule was often broken, but seldom on a happy ship. He was unpopular within the Admiralty for his spate of letter writing. Not only that, there was a bit of a scandal with Prince William, who was one of the captains that served under him during his stay in Jamaica. The cost for Nelson, partially for his moral courage, but more so for the way that he had gone about it, was quite high. For taking the moral high ground and enforcing the Navigation Act on behalf of the King, Nelson expected a reward from the Admiralty. However, he was sent to the Nore, where the Boreas was used as a receiving ship for men rounded up by the press gang. There were concerns about a war with the Dutch, and there were never enough seamen. Parties would be sent out to round up able-bodied men between 18 and 55. The conditions on Royal Navy ships were not great, and Samuel Johnson, the English poet, once said, "No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. For being in a ship is being in jail with the chance of being drowned. A man in a jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company." This is the work that Nelson was now doing. And now, Nelson, at this point in his career, was very disillusioned by the reception that he got from the Admiralty. And he spoke to some of his friends about his intentions to resign from an ungrateful service. He even entertained the thought of serving in the Russian Navy. After the peace of 1783, at least 20 English captains served in the Russian Navy, and the Grand Admiral of the Russian fleet was English as well. Towards the end of 1787, the Boreas was finally paid off. During the 18 months that Nelson had commanded the Boreas, he had flogged 66 of the 142 seamen and marines under his command, so almost half of them had been flogged. That gives a little bit of an insight as to what morale would have been like on the ship. For Nelson, rather than getting the ship of the line that he wanted, he was put into reserve and kept on half pay. It wasn't until January 1793 that he was again recalled to the Navy when he was given command of the 64-gun HMS Agamemnon. The strategic picture for Britain was becoming increasingly dire. On September the 21st, 1792, the French king King Louis XVI had been executed by guillotine in France. The likelihood of war with France was increasing, and the Royal Navy was going around recalling its officers and starting to fit out for war. And indeed, on the 1st of February, France declared war on Britain. Nelson was back. So what I hope to do in this episode is to give you a bit of the flavour of what Nelson was like before the French Revolutionary War. At this point in his career, he's had around 20 years' experience in the Navy. He'd lent into every opportunity that he could to further his career with new experiences. He was very effective at building relationships with his peers. He was very effective building relationships with some of his superiors, not all of them. And indeed, his 4 years on the reserve list are an example of some of the issues that he had with his superiors. A harsh disciplinarian, the kind of feeling that he was able to engender amongst the seamen on his ships towards the end of his career hadn't truly developed at this point. He was not only capable of independent action, he relished it. And that, in conjunction with his burning sense of duty, I think gives a fairly good word picture of what Nelson was like coming into the war that would define him. We're starting to see his sense of mission command and the way that he interprets what it is that needs to be done and why it needs to be done. We're starting to see that in his personality. And at this point in his career, I think that it's his skill as a leader that is getting him by. But as his career develops, we will see how he is able to engender that sense of mission command in his subordinates and really get the most out of them. In the next few podcasts, we're going to look at a couple of important battles, I think, that really do highlight some of the principles that he used in his theory of leadership and in his theory of mission command. We're going to look at Cape St. Vincent. We're then going to look at the Battle of the Nile, his most important battle. After that, we're going to go to the Battle of Copenhagen, the famous Battle of Copenhagen where he is said to have put his telescope to his blind eye and say, "I really cannot see that signal," which is where he is said to have ignored a direct order from his commanding officer. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into that because the story is a great story of mission command, but it's not the story that a lot of people think that it is. And then we will finish off with Trafalgar. Of course, we're going to have to finish with Trafalgar. Nelson's crowning battle, his final battle, the battle where he famously signalled that England expects that every man will do his duty. So there you go. Hopefully you've got a little bit of a better understanding about Nelson. He's quite a complex character, and I think there's lots to learn. In keeping with the naval flavour of this PME podcast, I am now off to splice the main brace. Bye.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.